And to all of you, welcome to the third annual Obama Scholars Lecture Program Series. Launched in 2018, the Obama Scholars Program serves students who will become agents of change in keeping with the spirit and legacy of President Obama's historic presidency. And with the full support of President Obama, the Obama Scholars Program here at Oxy provides a comprehensive Oxy experience for exceptional students of all backgrounds. The emphasis is on first-generation students, community college transfers, and veterans. And each Obama Scholar gets a full ride, support for the program, or from the program's advisory council, and other Obama Fellows and summer opportunities. And we have a couple of Obama Scholars here present today. I'd like to recognize Sharon Abubakar. You can. Sharon is a sophomore from Arizona and is interested in a medical career. And then Jacqueline Alcantara. And Jacqueline is a first-year student from Houston, a first-generation college student exploring urban and environmental policy as well as public health and sociology. The speaker series is really the public-facing aspect of the Scholars Program. It brings to campus prominent figures who can provide an historical perspective on the Obama presidency and explore contemporary issues as well. And previous speakers have included Ben Rhodes, the former National Deputy Security Advisor to President Obama, David Plouffe, who was his President Obama's campaign manager and a senior White House advisor. And today we will be talking about Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and how that was overturned. And I would just encourage you all to keep in your minds the law of unintended consequences. And to lead this conversation, I can't think of anybody better qualified to provide an introduction and to work with the panelists than Philip Ayub, an associate professor of diplomacy and world affairs here at Oxy. Philip joined the Oxy faculty in 2018, focusing in on transnational politics, gender politics, and norm diffusion and the study of social movements. More specifically, he is an expert in the history of LGBTQ activism here in the United States and in Europe, and how these movements have transcended national boundaries and acted upon each other. And it's this approach that has informed his pioneering 2016 book, published by the Cambridge University Press, When States Come Out, Europe's Sexual Minorities and the Politics of Visibility. So please join me in welcoming Professor Ayub. Put
this down a little bit. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Bill, for that generous introduction. And thank you so much to the Obama Scholar Series, Speaker Series, for organizing this fantastic event. It's a great honor for me to be able to in a moment, introduce you to these leading pioneers sitting next to me. Before I do that, I was asked in the spirit of the Obama Speaker Series to talk briefly about my work in relation to the United States standing on LGBT rights globally. And this is kind of an interesting way to look at the U.S. because when I started doing my work on LGBT rights in the mid-2000s, it was a different administration. It was the administration of George W. Bush. And I was doing a lot of work in countries with activists that were organizing on the ground that had a lot of support from other states that were considered, quote-unquote leaders on these issues. They were flying rainbow flags at their embassies, funding initiatives, queer festivals, helping initiate the first prides, et cetera. And the United States was painfully absent in a lot of those events, despite being a global hegemon on a lot of issues. You didn't see a presence the way you did with some other countries. And that is something that is quite ironic given the role of the United States in activism on these issues. While other countries might have been home to the first activist movements in the 1800s and also in the pre-World War II and the immediate post-World War II activism on LGBT issues, the United States American activists following the fervor of civil rights and also women's liberation in the 60s really opened the door to a new kind of activism that inspired the world, in part, including activists like Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson, and many, many others whose gay liberation politics changed the way we went about these issues, increasing a lot of public visibility that many scholars say has translated into the tremendous kind of increase in rights for these communities. Yet that said, the reason this is ironic is in part because the United States itself would remain, and to some degree still remains, a laggard on a lot of issues of LGBT rights. And this is, there's many examples of this. For example, it decriminalized same-sex relations decades after many of its peers. Actually, Professor David Frank, who joins us from Irvine, is one of the leading experts on this issue. There's other examples. If we think of marriage equality, for example, which we did 26 years after the Danes introduced civil partnership and 14 years after the Dutch led with full marriage equality. And the list, the list goes on, and it is definitely surprising for a state like this to have this kind of backseat role. That said, a lot changed with the election of the Obama administration, and this connects back here to the speaker series, which was something that I noticed a lot as I continued on in my research, where after that election, you immediately saw that from that absence, you saw a very active presence of the US State Department under Hillary Clinton and also of the Obama administration on these issues. And these, these efforts resulted in many successes. I'm going to name just a few, even though I could go on much longer. The Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act was signed into law in the year 2009. In February 2011, President Obama announced that the Department of Justice would no longer defend the Defense of Marriage Act provision defining marriage as between a man and a woman. That would lead, of course, to the Supreme Court's landmark decisions in 2013 and 2015. The administration also took unprecedented steps to protect and promote the rights of transgender and gender nonconforming Americans, including guidance from the U.S. Departments of Education and Justice to provide educators with information that they requested to ensure that all students can attend school in an environment free of discrimination. And the subject for today, the president signed a bipartisan legislation alongside actually several of our guests sitting here, bipartisan legislation to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell on December 22nd, 2010. So these developments, while they are local developments, they also reverberated around the world. For example, in the 12 months after President Obama became the first sitting president to say that he supported marriage equality in May of 2012, 5 countries would introduce that such legislation, and 4 would start it in progress in that moment to show kind of also the power of U.S. cultural hegemony. And many states, of course, would follow. We now live in a world that has, where multiple countries have introduced marriage equality. Under the Obama administration, the U.S. government would also begin making support for such rights a foreign policy priority, including the appointing of a special envoy for LGBT and intersex rights at the State Department in 2015. This kind of leadership is painfully absent today, both at home and abroad. While the Trump administration has supported a plan of the former ambassador to Germany, Richard Grenell, to decriminalize homosexuality worldwide, it has been widely criticized by activists, given that many of them weren't involved. It's also being criticized as being laced with kind of homo-nationalist endeavors to justify restrictions on immigration, and also sometimes being criticized for branding certain countries as backwards or ripe for war, especially with its focus on the state of Iran. So furthermore, the record at home, which has involved multiple steps backwards, especially on trans rights, while fueling conservative initiatives to halt progress for LGBT people, has left many folks that work on LGBT rights, both on the ground and in the academy, with quite a bit of concern. So with this context in mind, I will now want to introduce and turn over the panel to our outstanding speakers today to speak on repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Just to give you a moment of context, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was instituted by the Clinton administration in 1994 as a political compromise because Bill Clinton had promised to allow all citizens to serve in the military regardless of sexual orientation. Yet Don't Ask, Don't Tell prohibited discrimination against, or while it did against closeted service members, it barred being open because, I quote, their presence would create an unacceptable risk to the high standards of morale, good order, and discipline, and unit cohesion that are the essence of military capability. Speaking on these topics today, we are honored to have Joe Solmonese, who is former president of the Human Rights Campaign, which played a key role in lobbying for the repeal. Joe is currently CEO of the 2020 Democratic National Convention Committee and managing partner of the corporate consulting firm of Gavin and Solmonese, where he leads the firm's corporate and nonprofit engagement practice. Before forming Gavin and Solmonese, he served as president of the HRC and CEO of Emily's List, one of the nation's largest political action committees. He is also a member of the Obama Scholars Advisory Council here at Occidental College. Next, we have retired Marine Staff Sgt. Eric Alva, who is a decorated war veteran and LGBTQ and diversity activist. He's the first American soldier injured in the Iraq War. Sergeant Alva came out as gay after his retirement from the military. As spokesman for the Human Rights Campaign, he played an instrumental role in the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Eric is sitting right here, sorry, and Joe is sitting in the middle there. I'm realizing as I'm speaking that my order is off here in the notes. On the other end, we have Brian Bond, who is Executive Director of PFLAG, the country's first and largest organization for LGBTQ+ people and their parents, families, and allies. Prior to joining PFLAG, Bond served as Coalitions Director for the Climate Action Campaign in Washington, D.C. And during the Obama administration, he served as Deputy Director of the White House Office for Public Engagement and primary liaison for the LGBT community, the first to serve in that role. Here next to Eric, we have Army Sergeant First Class Freyja Eccles, who is an Iraq war veteran and active duty transgender soldier with 21 years of service. Sergeant Eccles was twice deployed in Iraq and served in the Army for 2 decades before coming out publicly as transgender. She currently serves as Brigade SHARP Victim Advocate. SHARP stands for Sexual Harassment Assault Response Prevention, and Sexual Assault Response Coordinator. She is Vice President of the San Antonio Gender Association and is working with San Antonio Pride Center to start the first trans feminine support group in San Antonio. We also have next to Brian at the other end, Robin McGehee, who is co-founder of GetEQUAL, a direct action and advocacy group that seeks to empower the LGBTQ community by demanding social and political equality. A longtime communications instructor at the College of Canyons, Robin helped organize Meet in the Middle for Equality, which is a statewide reaction to the passage of Prop 8 in California, and was co-director of the 2009 Equality March in Washington, D.C. Furthermore, her activism led to an invitation to the White House to witness the signing of the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell by President Obama. Thank you so much for joining us here today at Occidental.
Thank you all, and I want to thank Occidental for having us. I want to thank President Veach. As you heard, I'm a member of the Obama Scholars Advisory Committee, and it's a great privilege to serve in that role, and it's been incredibly inspiring for me to learn about and get to know some of the students who are here and who are doing really transformative work. But it's particularly inspiring for me because, as you heard, over the course of my tenure at the Human Rights Campaign, I had the opportunity on a number of issues to work alongside President Obama on some of the historic advances that you just heard about. And so, in the course of my conversations with President Veach, we were talking about social change and some of the kind of really, I think, learning opportunities and moments where we can really draw some lessons about the broader fight going forward around issues of social change by looking at those moments in the Obama administration where we were particularly successful. And you know, I thought about it as I was sitting here. We could have had quite a long conversation about the fight for marriage equality or any of the other big sweeping advancements that we've made over the course of the fight for LGBT equality. But what I thought was particularly interesting about the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell is that the sort of, in as much as the fight went on for about 17 years before we were successful, the period when we actually took it up in earnest in the Obama administration and successfully were a part of the president signing it into law was a little over the course of a year. And we as a group, who I should tell you, we're very happy to be back together today. We haven't seen each other since we were slugging it out behind the scenes and then standing together at that historic bill signing. But we as a group thought that, you know, that period of time would be a particularly interesting one to focus on. I can just say, for my part, I came to the Human Rights Campaign to lead that organization in 2005. As you mentioned, President Bush was in office, and we had a White House and a Congress that was, really anti-LGBT to the point that if you remember, in 2003 we won the first marriage case in the Massachusetts Supreme Court. It was, like many things, right, the spark that began the marriage equality fight, but also when you light a spark that big and that sort of, earth-shattering, what happened after that was that 13 states around the country in the 2004 elections put marriage bans on the ballot. Those were really advanced and supported by the Bush administration as a way to turn out a segment of the electorate that would be helpful to him. And then after he was reelected, the beginning of my work at the Human Rights Campaign, and certainly my colleagues up here, was really all about trying to fight off attempts to write permanent discrimination against marriage equality into the Constitution in the form of the Federal Marriage Amendment. So when President Obama was elected, and then we had a Congress, and I say that not to be partisan, I'm not sure if I can be partisan and political in this space, but to say that when we had President Obama elected in a Democratic House and a Senate, it really presented for us the first time really ever, I think, to make significant legislative advances in behalf of LGBT equality. And obviously, we, as you heard, the president also did things through executive order, bringing down the ban against HIV-positive people coming into this country. We obviously won things through the courts, like the overturning of DOMA and ultimately marriage equality. But when President Obama was elected in 2008, we had a 2-year period where we had the House and the Senate in Democratic hands, and a period where we really had the opportunity to get a lot done. And of course, as you may remember, we lost control of those chambers in 2010, and beyond that period, it was very difficult for the president to get much done, on any manner of progressive issues. And so, as you heard, when the president was elected and members of the LGBT community came in to speak with him, I think that it was not surprising that when we did a sort of an audit of where we were in terms of building legislative and public opinion support for many of the potential issues that we could advance, the Matthew Shepard hate crimes bill was really at the top of the list. We had a very diverse coalition of civil rights organizations and labor unions and the Anti-Defamation League and all sorts of kind of a broad cross-section of diverse stakeholders who had done a great deal of work. I think we felt like we had a strong vote in the House and a strong vote in the Senate, and the possibility to pass that into law, and not just because substantively it was important to pass it into law, but tactically and strategically, I think we all agreed that the first one, right, needed to work, right? The first thing we kind of came out of the box with in terms of a legislative fight needed to be a successful one. And there were those in our community who felt like we should have taken something more challenging and more difficult on something that maybe had more expansive reach for more people. But I think tactically, the Obama administration and many of us agreed that the first thing that we did needed to be overwhelmingly successful. And of course, the passage of the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act was, in fact, an overwhelmingly successful vote and I think a moment that the president could point to as the beginning of his legislative fights with us. After the hate crimes bill was signed into law, again, we came back together as a community with the leadership of the House, Speaker Pelosi, and at the time Senator Reid, and members of the community and the White House, and made the determination that the next legislative fight that we would take on was Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And so, as I said, from the time we took that fight up until the last days of December in 2010, when, by the way, the Democrats had lost control of the Congress at that point. We actually signed Don't Ask, Don't Tell into law in a lame duck session after we had lost control of Congress. That period is one that I have felt like really was a classic example of us doing everything right And I say that only to say that we did many things wrong in other fights. So it was not always that way, but we did everything right. I think we pulled every lever and we brought every sort of force to bear in the most strategically impactful way that we could have, and in a way that, that helped us to be successful. And you know, I talked to somebody about this recently, and you know, it's hard to imagine the 10 years have gone by, because they said, well, you know, how hard could it be to like advance the idea that, you know, gays and lesbians should be able to serve in the military? And I come up against this a lot. You know, I was saying it's like the success has been at such a rapid pace that sometimes we forget, you know, and so in as much as I say we did everything right in repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, you know, we passed it through the House. We failed in the Senate twice in 2010 before we actually were successful, because of the really intense resistance among many members of the Senate to getting something that, you know, we all felt like was just a fundamentally basic thing that ought to happen. And so, you know, these are the people who I worked with on that, who we came together and brought to bear many different tactical strategies to get it done. And we've talked a lot over the years about what worked and what didn't, and how much of what we did can serve as a model for other social change fights that us or others in progressive circles might take on. And so we thought it would be interesting to kind of talk with you today about that period, and about some of the things that we did and what we learned and what we did right and what we did wrong. And then we'd love to kind of turn it to you to see if there are other things you'd like to talk about, or, you know, questions about this that you might like to learn more about. And then I've got a question or two that has been submitted. And so I wanted to start actually with Brian Bond. As you heard, Brian served as the Deputy Director of Public Engagement in the Obama White House. So for many of us who were advocates on a whole range of issues, Brian was our principal point of contact in the White House. And from where you sat, Brian, I thought it might be interesting for you to kind of expand on this idea of, I always tell the story that the United States Senate passed the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell on Saturday morning, December, was it your 19th, in the middle of a snowstorm. And actually, in the afternoon, the DREAM Act, right, which the DREAM Act was brought to the Senate floor in the morning, and Don't Ask, Don't Tell was brought to the Senate floor in the early afternoon. We had gone along all through 2010 in sort of parallel tracks with the immigration reform community, with folks who are doing really good work to try to you know, help dreamers and get the DREAM Act passed. And one of the, you know, probably most bittersweet moments in all of this was that on that day, on December 19th, where we had just pushed that boulder up the hill and failed so many times before we succeeded, the DREAM Act failed on the Senate floor in the morning, and we succeeded on the Senate floor in the early afternoon. And there were other instances of that over the course of that year where I saw, you know, other progressive fights just not fare as well as this one did. And so I was wondering, Brian, if you could sort of kick it off by talking a little bit more about, from where you sat, you know, what it was that you thought worked about this and how that contrasted with other things that didn't work quite so well.
Sure. I guess you can hear me. Hey, Brian Bond, my pronouns are he, him, and his. I was the, I guess, the LGBT liaison. My boss was Valerie Jarrett, who many of you may know, who was senior advisor to the president, the longest terming senior advisor, huge advocate for the community. Before I kind of go down this road, I do want to also recognize Eric's husband, Danny, who has given a lot of service to this country, as both in uniform and as an advocate when we were trying to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So I just want to acknowledge you as well. It's humbling to be up with this crowd right now. Some of us had more than one run-in over the course of that time. But I do think I'll talk less about the, I want to give more of a context, I guess, as to, because I don't know that there's a clear-cut answer as to why we were successful, but yet on repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, while the DREAM Act did not. But so I think this context may help a little bit. So November 2008, just I don't want to use the word incredible. This amazing thing happened on November 4th, 2008. Barack Obama was elected President of the United States. At Grant Park, any of you who've ever watched the speech he gave there and saw the crowd, it was America turning a page. Whether it got a little sausage making after that, but at least for that moment, it was unique. And then at the same time that happened, Prop 8 in California. And you saw rights being taken away. And then to Joe's point before that in 2004, you saw this coordinated effort by powerful people to take away our rights, to use basically marriage as a tool to drive up conservative votes, to win at all costs. Sound a little familiar to maybe a potential election cycle coming up? Oops, did I say that? I will not go there. So you start off, and I'll be candid there, and we talked about this a little earlier. Much of the LGBTQ plus community actually was with Hillary Clinton in the primary stage. Everybody got on board. We were all in. Everybody was all in and focused on electing Barack Obama, the next president of the United States. And I was in the middle of this, and it just was not handled right. But just right out of the gate, one of the first experiences was inauguration, where we had Reverend Warren speak or give a prayer at the inauguration, which he is no friend of the community. But he speaks to President Obama's desire to work across lines, to meet people where they are, to try to move people along. It caused a huge ruckus, which Joe was very aware of and was taking some hits on. So you had a community coming into this administration a little bit with a belief of, okay, literally this is the next Jesus Christ. We're going to get everything we want. We're going to get it all done. Then you come into this with a couple of errors and third, maybe this wasn't somebody we knew as well as some of the other players in the race. So there was, and then again, the defeats from previous years. So you had, in my humble opinion, this pent up desire to get shit done. Excuse my language, but just we want this now. We need this now. The president's first act was to sign the Lilly Ledbetter Act, and the LGBTQ plus community was okay. We're next. We need this to happen. The one caution and Joe gave the history of hate crimes, and that was a perfect description of how that came out and how it was done. And one of the other priorities on the legislative list was ENDA as well. So there were several priorities on the LGBTQ bucket. Other buckets included what we were going to do around choice, what we were going to do around immigration, and then here's the biggest one of all. Our country was in a free fall economically. And that, people forget that sometimes, but that consumed every moment of space in the first period of the White House, trying to turn the economic engine around or trying to stave off a depression. It was huge. And it doesn't mean we couldn't chew gum and walk at the same time. All these other things needed to be done. But I think it's kind of important for that context. The other piece of context I would give is that there were two wars going on at the same time. So there were multiple there were these conflicts, these wars that were impacting human life that were of a major priority to the president. And what I would say, even with those two wars going on, I believe it is the very first, if not the second meeting, when President Obama sat down with Secretary Gates from DOD. Don't Ask, Don't Tell was on his radar from that moment on. But I don't know if this context helps or not, and some of you may disagree with it, but there was a lot going on at the time. But there were a lot of real feelings that stuff needed to get done. From an LGBTQ plus perspective, we were way behind where we should be at this stage of the game, and and everybody in the building knew that. Much to my chagrins, which you know all too well and quote often, one of the president's first speeches when he talked about LGBTQ plus issues was basically push me. I really wish he hadn't have said that. Make me do it. Make me do it. I really wish he hadn't have done that because they did. They did push. And you know what? He's a community organizer. He meant it. You know, the rest of us are going like, no, we'll get there. But you know, when he said those words at that speech, I was like, and then he kept repeating them. I'm like, oh God. But he meant what he said. And I just want to give you a sense into the heart of the president. Two things. One is a little lighter. He's not really, but the president wasn't a big fan of going and taping videos, but he had to do them all the time, obviously. And the whole It Gets Better phenomena that was going on. And if you haven't seen the president's It Gets Better video, you should watch it. It's really good. And we were in the room while he was taping it, and this is how personal it was for him, because there were kids committing suicide. I mean, it was getting a little scary at the moment. I mean, not that it's not happening now, but it seemed like there was this uptick happening. And so he did his video, and he was zinging through it, halfway through it. All of a sudden, he went off script. He stopped, and he said, no, I need to speak directly to the kids. And so he did his own piece of that. It was that personal, that important to him, that he connect with the kids, especially in the LGBTQ plus space around this. And the second thing, which made things a little longer down the road, if you will, he didn't say this, I'm saying this. The prior occupant of the White House to him, I think some people could argue maybe didn't follow the Constitution maybe the way they should have all the time, maybe the Justice Department. Again, wow, I'm hearing things coming up again here, but President Obama was a big believer in the rule of law, and he was a big believer in following the Constitution. There was a lot of pressure on the president to sign an executive order to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell. First of all, his frame of mind is, this is a law, we need to repeal the law. Second piece, it's easy to look back in the rearview mirror now, but if you look at some of the actions of the current administration, if Don't Ask, Don't Tell had been an executive order, it could have easily been repealed by this administration, and God knows what would happen to so many of the brave men and women and others that are serving in our service right now. So he had a long game around that we needed to hash this out, that it needed to be a law. And I would say the same thing if you ever have another panel discussion around marriage. Again, he charged his lawyers, if you will, Bob Bauer and others, to, it's not my job as president to not defend the Constitution. We can certainly, through our Justice Department, we were able to start to tone down the briefs, because as Joe will remember, that first brief, if you ever want to look up something for fun, look up the smelt brief. It was not pretty at all, but we learned from that. But the president he charged his lawyers with the responsibility of finding a way through, a legal way through, for him not to defend DOMA, and then to call for repeal and to move forward on that front. And that would be in the Second Circuit, and that was his window to do that. So I give you all that just as context of kind of his mindset. On a personal note, because I was kind of getting beat up quite a bit. So it was, there's a little therapy going on here today, trust me. We haven't seen each other in years. But the Christmas before, Christmas of 2009, the president would go to Hawaii for Christmas. There was a birthday party in the Roosevelt room, and I went with my bosses, Tina Chin and Valerie Jarrett. And we were just in there, and the president was kind of going around. He was getting ready to jump on Air Force One, but he went around the room, said Merry Christmas, whatever, to everybody, Happy Holidays, as people were going out the door. And I was standing there, and I'm like, okay, here's my chance to be that advocate, and what am I going to bring up? And in my head, I'm just going, oh, I just can't it's Christmas. I can't bring up any LGBT stuff right now. I just can't. He's going to look at me like I've lost my mind. And he comes over to me, he puts his hand on my shoulder, and he said, we're going to get Don't Ask, Don't Tell done next year. I've got a little bit of work to do with Congress and a little bit of work to do with the Pentagon, but we're going to get it done. Valerie looked at me, said, that's your Christmas present. You should leave now while you're ahead. all that to say, it was not easy, and I hope we get into this discussion a little bit. You'll get top lines of it as we go along here, but there really was an inside game, an outside game, and there's kind of there's a whole other category too that was playing itself out that I don't know if we'll touch on much, but so I'll just bring it up. But the courts. So the Department of Defense did not want the courts making these decisions. And you had cases like Log Cabin versus the U.S. You had Margaret Witt versus the U.S. Air Force. You had PR issues. You had like Victor Fehrenbach, who is being discharged. So there was this whole concern that Secretary Gates, I don't want to speak for him, but that the military had it, and Dan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but they did not want the courts dictating, and it was pretty clear where the courts were likely going to go. They did not want the courts dictating that. So that's why, and to Joe's point, the fact that there was a new Congress coming in that would likely not be as friendly. Everybody's work was cut out. The one last thing, and I'll shut up, is a lot of the activists got extremely upset when President Obama called on the Department of Defense to do a study. And this kind of goes back to the why don't you just do an executive order? But there was a need to socialize this change within the armed services to allow at every level people to feel like they had been heard, and for cohesion. People needed to be respected. And it got done, I think it was finalized like November 30th or something, okay? And we have a month now to do something with that. And so it was just mayhem at the last part of that. To Joe's point, like McCain a couple times just knocked this off. It's off course. Ultimately, it needed to be a standalone bill. In the House, Patrick Murphy and Speaker Pelosi were heroes in helping push that through. On the Senate side, it was a much kind of odder coalition of Leader Reid and then Collins and Lieberman and then Levin. I mean, it was just this interesting mix on the Senate side for it to go through. So to answer your actual question, I think it goes back to not that any of the other issues weren't of priority or weren't of concern or of equal importance. There had been years of built up tension that allowed for both an outside game to push inside to get some of this done. So that's my kind of take on it.
I think one of the other things that I'd mentioned that the first legislative effort that we took on was the passage of the hate crimes bill, and I'd worked in Washington for 20 years and done many things, but I'd never been a lobbyist, and so I'd never sort of walked the halls of Capitol Hill, walked into the offices of members of Congress and tried to engage them on substantive conversations about changing their opinion about things. And the first opportunity that I had to do that was with Judy Shepard, the mother of Matthew Shepard, in attempting to pass the Matthew Shepard hate crimes prevention bill. And I'll tell you candidly that those were some of the most dispiriting and sometimes horrifying conversations I ever had in my work as an advocate, because members of Congress would say things like, "I don't have an LGBT community in my district." And sometimes, like I would think, "Where are you from?" And then I would say, no, of course not, like you all do. But, this is just not a priority for me, right? I'm sorry, we came in to talk to you about ending, hate violence against LGBT people, and it's just not a priority, Or things that would really, elicit a kind of an anger in you that would almost blind you to, sort of what it is that you needed to then move on from to get them where you needed them to go. But the thing that always kind of came back to me was that where we were most impactful is when we could bring real people with lived experiences in to talk about the circumstances of their lives. And so at some point, and he will remember the date better than I do, I got a note from Alva, who lived in Texas and told me that he was the first Marine seriously injured in the Iraq War, that he had come home a hero but had served in silence and wanted to step up and do what he could to try to help in repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And so I went to Texas to meet him. I'm proud to say we have been close friends ever since. And Eric was one of the many people when members said, you know, there's nobody in my district, or this is not an issue for me, or in the case of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, they would say, you know, I don't want to see people like you, Joe. And I was perfectly happy to interpret that any way that they wanted to. But I want to see real people from my district who want only to serve and who are unable to as a result of this policy. And so I do think one of the things that we did well was make sure that if that's what they asked for, that's what we gave them. And Eric really led the charge on that. And Eric, I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what some of those experiences were like for you in walking those halls and talking to those members and trying to bring them around.
Thank you. So even I know Philip mentioned it, and quick history lesson. Philip, we don't call Marines soldiers. That's Freyja. I'm a Marine. I'm just kidding. So yeah, sorry. So it's you know, so those of you, anybody in the audience have, or there are veterans in the audience first? There are veterans? Any veterans? Thank you for your service. And those of you who have family members in the military, or even those of you who are planning to join the military, it's a life experience you'll never regret. And so thank you to all your service and those who have family members. 10 years ago, let me just ask, 10 years ago, because I can tell from you sitting here looking at the audience, 10 years ago, who was in junior high or high school? Raise your hand. Raise your hand high, come on, guys. Well, I can tell like a majority of you all from us. So what you're hearing today is actually, you know, history of what happened, and that I think that makes us old now. So, and now I'm a college professor too. But it's interesting how life happens, and from what, you know, so I wasn't just the first Marine injured in Iraq. I was the first American injured in Iraq when Operation Iraqi Freedom started in March of 2003. I got out of my vehicle and stepped on a landmine. My right leg was amputated above the knee. I broke my left leg, and my right hand has nerve damage and everything. So when I got injured, people at the time, because as Joe and Brian mentioned, there was 2 wars going on, Operation Enduring Freedom, Operation Iraqi Freedom. And so when I got injured, I ended up on Oprah Winfrey, I ended up in People magazine, I ended up in Reader's Digest, I ended up in all these places people wanted to hear about service members. They wanted to hear the jobs we were doing, how was my recovering, how is the new walking going, how was life going for you. People had put me up on this pedestal to even call me hero, which I am not. But I was brave, I had courage and everything, but I had to hide who I was. As the wars went on, I paid attention, like Philip, you know, we talked about policy, and I saw things going on in the country I wasn't happy with. One, for my own state, Texas, we amended the state constitution by banning same-sex marriage. And the way the rhetoric was, people did it with a little stick figure of a man, then the plus sign, a woman, stick figure, and then it had big equal sign, and it said marriage. People had these yard signs that put that, you know, so marriage is between a man and a woman. You know, people had bumper stickers, you know. It was all kinds of things, and people always still asked me how I felt, and I would lie. I wasn't proud of the answers I gave, you know. And then until 2006, I started noticing more about states that were proposing policy changes. Mainly, the state constitution was banning same-sex marriage. And here I am, who I shed blood in Iraq, and I also served in Somalia. I can tell the majority of y'all weren't born in 1992, but I served in the movie Black Hawk Down. I see heads going, oh, I know that, Eric. So I served in Somalia as well. I was 22 at the time. So I served my country for the rights, the freedoms, the liberties, the happinesses of the people of this country. And then I thought for myself, that doesn't pertain to me because I'm gay. So I said, you know, that's when it was either fall, or it was fall, but it was the end of September or early October. I had really never heard of the Human Rights Campaign, and I knew all it was a little equal sign with a, you know, 2 yellow parallel bars on a navy backdrop. And I didn't have a sticker on my car. I really didn't pay attention to things that were pertain to the LGBT population, LGBTQ population. And I thought, shame on you, Eric. You know, here you are as a public figure now because you were injured first in the war. And I remember going to my parents first and getting their support, saying, I need you to support me on this. I want to do something. And they said, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to tell my story. Well, everybody knows you were the first American injured. And I said, no, I want to come out. And my dad was supportive, Vietnam veteran. My mom was a little apprehensive because she worries about, because we all know, like, you know, when Martin Luther King spoke out, what happened? Harvey Milk spoke out, what happened? Medgar Evers spoke out. Oscar Romero, people who spoke out on civil rights, what happens? There comes harm sometimes. And I think that's what she was more worried about. But I decided to get on the computer, www.hrc.org, and I send them an email saying, you don't know me, I was the first American injured in the Iraq War, I want to help. I didn't know what that fight was going to be, and this was in fall of 2006. Of course, you know, we're still a year and a half away from 2008. I get an email back from Joe's team, staff. I fly to, but you had come to San Antonio first to visit, and we had a 3-hour meeting. And we sat there talking. I told him about the day I got injured in detail. He cried, I cried. Then, of course, we fly to DC, and then that's when the light bulb went off, because then his team and the plan for HRC was not just hate crimes, but like, we have legislation possibly being introduced in 2007. We don't know when, maybe around the summer, but Congressman Martin Meehan from Massachusetts is going to introduce the Military Readiness Enhancement Act, which is a bill designed to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And before you know it, it wasn't going to be July. He introduced it in February. And so when I was out, it was Good Morning America broke the story. And people really then knew my true story. And I was now going to work with HRC and other groups and people and members of Congress. And to say members of Congress, it means going in even to my own congressman, Charlie Gonzalez at the time, and telling him, this is what I want to do, this is what I'm advocating for. And this is, you know, 2008, even when I started going to Congress or DC and everything. And even at the same time, my own congressman says, I can't sponsor that. No, 2007. He's like, he sat there as Freyja sits next to me saying, I'm sorry, Eric, but I can't co-sponsor that bill. And I'm like, why? This isn't just the time and everything. And so I pressured people. And I think I scared people, because meetings I asked for with certain individuals, they wouldn't take it. They would send their legislative director, or they would send their, you know, intern. And I'm like, are you interning from Georgetown? I am. How did you know? I just figured, you know, because your representative or your senator doesn't want to face me, because I would put them on the spotlight to say, I fought for this country, so why can't I have what you have as far as equality, freedom, things like that. And so I think it's interesting how life happens, because I'm not saying it was meant for me to happen, but I believe it was a forces of great nature that, you know, it was meant for me to contact Joe and his team and become the national spokesperson on repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Because it is true on telling personal stories. I fought for this country. I fought for every single individual, not just the selected few. I fought for women's rights. I fought for immigration. I fought for LGBTQ rights. I fought for people of color. I fought for everybody, you know, and to especially the people like Freyja who's continuing to serve in the armed forces. And we don't know what could happen tomorrow. Freyja could be sent to Syria or another country in a hostile environment again, and to put your life on the line. And we will never know the number of LGBT service members who lost or paid the ultimate sacrifice in Afghanistan and Iraq, who weren't even out. But then to give them the injustice of not having the freedoms that we all had, you know, is just is unheard of, or unimaginable to think of. So working with HRC and having those conversations with members of Congress, and to all of you, all of you know, the Obama scholars and all of you, bright, young, very courageous, intelligent individuals, always tell your stories. There could be someone in here who has not disclosed of their identity because fear of what your parents are going to say, or fear of your family, or even your friends. Majority of my buddies in the Marine Corps all were pretty cool and said, you're my brother, I still love you, things like that. But telling my story, I think, was a piece of adding to personal testimony of these are the people who served in the military. these are the people, because when I testified on the House Armed Services Committee, you had this awful individual, I won't say her name, who sat next to me, and she said, because the stereotypes people do, even as far as the current administration, like to incite fear. You know, this one lady individual said, you know, if you repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell, those people are going to bring their disease to the armed forces. You know, then she also said, we know how gay people are. They're promiscuous. You're going to have a rise in sexual assaults, men raping men, women raping women. You cannot do this. You're going to ruin the camaraderie. You're going to ruin the national security of this country. If we didn't have 9/11 happen, now it's going to happen again. You know, what they were saying is people of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender identities, that we are a disruption to society. You know, we have mental illness, we're cruel, we're just, you know, all these awful things. And that's where I knew I was doing the right thing, because you need to speak your life. You need to tell your stories and share who you are, because it's important, because no one should ever oppress someone for their own fear, you know, or ignorance, because it is. And so sitting back here after 10 years, it's an honor to be with this group, and then an honor to have even Sergeant Eccles here, you know, still serving and as a fellow service member. But my biggest honor was working with these amazing individuals, Robin, Brian, Joe, and now with Freyja, who still, and you'll hear her personal story, because the fight's not over. The fight's not over. We know that there's a ban on transgender individuals. There could be someone who attends your school as transgender and decides, when I graduate, I want to serve in the military. Well, you can't. There's a ban on transgender individuals applying to the military. So the fight is not over. We still have work to do. We always have to make sure that, you know, history doesn't repeat itself, as Joe was talking about, or Brian was talking about, that you could easily sign an executive order, and thank God we didn't, because who knows what would have happened during this current administration. But I think, you know, not just working with these individuals and still talking to members of Congress, even my own congressman who is Republican and things like that, it does make people think and change. I'm not asking you to change your party's designation. If you want to be this or that, then that's fine. But let's all work together to make sure people are treated with, you know, dignity, respect, self-worth, and the same equality, even equal pay for women. I'm sorry, you know, that's about time. When I served in the Marine Corps, Marine Corps is very narcissistic. We like to get in our dress blues and look at ourselves in the mirror for hours, you know. But a lot of times people said, women do not belong in combat. Well, let me tell you, as of last August, or in 2018, the Marine Corps has now had its first female infantry officer introduced into the Marine Corps. So those of you familiar with California, go to Camp Pendleton, which is predominantly infantry. You have a female standing in front of a platoon of 25 men. Guess who the boss is? She is. She tells them what to do, because she is the infantry officer. That means she's going to be on the front lines with her men. And we're changing, we're evolving. And it wasn't because, you know, she's a female, she couldn't do it. You know, it was fear. But let people be judged for their merit, their professionalism, what they contribute. And so we still have things to do. But my biggest honor, and thanks to Joe and Brian and everyone, that when it came for the day of the signing, I got to stand behind President Obama. Close enough to smell his cologne, let me just say. But what a remarkable history. And when you leave here today, go to YouTube and listen to his words when he spoke before the signing and what he did. But it is something that is a history lesson for all of us, and to even still that I still advocate for change and use my voice. Danny, my husband, we use our voices for change, not just more than ever, especially in Texas, on immigration, and to not build a wall, but to knock the hell out of that damn thing that's getting built. You know, because people deserve to have the same happiness as anyone else. All of you there, anyone graduating in May, congratulations. Now you have grad school, so, but go out there, use your voices, use what you learn, and don't let anyone tell you no just because they think they're in charge, or, you know, that they have this kind of power. This is your life. Nobody owns your happiness, so live it fully. But having those conversations with people is important, especially members of Congress. They're your elected officials. So continue to do that. I hope I answered your question in a way. So you're like, no, Eric.
No, you did.
Yeah, okay. So.
No, I mean, I think, you know, what I but I hope you got, and what you can imagine is how impactful Eric was and others who had served alongside him, in really changing hearts and minds. And in as much as I think we had an incredibly compelling group of advocates out there on the front lines doing the work, as Brian mentioned and I alluded to with regard to Don't Ask, Don't Tell, we passed it in the Senate and the House early in the year, and then we failed twice. Senator McCain and others were really adamantly opposed to repeal, and in the Senate it's just harder to get things done than it is in the House. And so we failed, and there were moments in the summer and into the fall where I really felt that we were not going to be able to get it done. And as Brian mentioned, there was a fair amount of impatience and concern and anger in the community that we weren't pushing as hard as we could, and that we needed to bring other forces to bear in order to really turn up the temperature and make sure that we got it done. And so along came Robin to hold our feet to the fire and make sure that we did. And so, as the president would say, and the rest of us would say, that the disruption to the system and the and the intensity around making sure that we did everything that we could to get this done was something that was incredibly helpful. And so I'm going to turn it to Robin to talk about GetEQUAL and the work that they did to really add to the impact in this fight.
So you could tell I'm the troublemaker, obviously. My part in all of this was feeling like we were one spoke in a wheel that was really trying to push for change. And I look at it from three different elements. One, I knew what the sticker was. I was a donor to HRC. I had campaigned for Barack Obama, went door to door with my son, and on the night that we lost Prop 8, I watched the president that told us that he was going to be a social advocate for change and going to fight for our community. I watched him win, and that gave me tremendous hope. But what I will say is that, to Brian's point, he and in reference to the work that I saw HRC doing, they were doing what their role is. Their role is to lobby. His role is to advise the president and push for as much as he can. But we were in a political climate where we had 2 years to get anything substantially done, unless we won the House and the Senate back. And at that time, we had no guarantee. We had 2 years to make a difference. And we know that because Barack Obama couldn't even get a Supreme Court nominee approved. And if we had not taken that political window and pushed, I believe that we would not be having this conversation today. And that's not just to the credit of GetEQUAL, but that's the credit to everybody that was a spoke in the wheel to say we've got full urgency. And the way that I like the metaphor that I would use is, he said, they didn't feel we were pushing enough. And I felt like we were a starving individual sitting at a table that finally had a meal put in front of them. And we couldn't eat fast enough. We didn't want to get it taken away from us. And as far as I was concerned, we wanted as much as they'd put at the table. And so in reference to the element of that political moment, we also had a president who, although he said, make me do it, he also wasn't willing to politically come out and say that he supported marriage equality at the time. And now, looking back on that, that's, asinine to think about. President Obama goes down, in my opinion, as the best president I've ever witnessed, and will go down in history as one of the best presidents I believe this country ever had. But in that particular element and political climate, he was not willing to say that we deserve the right of marriage publicly. And so that political climate, in my opinion, is where we needed iconic imagery that went with the lobbying that was happening, that went with the conversations that Brian and others were having within the White House. And I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, and I can remember spending days seeing imagery of the lunch counters that had been sat in and visiting the jail cell where Martin Luther King was behind bars calling his wife, writing letters, and seeing the bridge where John Lewis had his skull bashed in. And in reality, you know, the street signs that say Martin Luther King or Medgar Evers Boulevard are a lineage to people who actually took risk and who actually put their bodies on the line and said, I am going to create iconic imagery that you cannot deny. And so in my opinion, we also saw that in the HIV and AIDS movement with Larry Kramer and ACT UP, people who were doing die-ins and actually sending messages that there was a sense of urgency. And so what I believe our role was creating the iconic imagery that went with the conversations that Joe, Eric, Brian were having. And the one story that I will tell you, or I'll tell you two quickly. The first one is our first arrest, the day that we launched GetEQUAL, we had 2 Army service members that had been kicked out under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. They were Army. One was an Arabic linguist, Lieutenant Dan Choi, and Sergeant Jim Peter Angelo were arrested. And the day after, we got intel from people that we had as insiders at the Pentagon, and they said that people within the Pentagon were saying, well, you'd expect that from 2 Army guys. They're not smart enough. That's what they would do. And so the very next month, we said, okay, well, we're going to go back, and we had every branch of the military, the Coast Guard, the Marine, the Air Force, as well as a transgender service member, to show them that we are every branch of the military, we are every element of the community, and we will not be denied. And so it was that iconic imagery to say, we'll take what you're saying publicly, and we're going to create the imagery that shows you that you're wrong. And the second one that Joe has talked about was Jim Webb. Senator Webb had gone on the floor of the Senate talking about funding for the military, wearing his son's combat boots. And we read that story, and what we would do, like they would think about what's the story that's going to reach this person in a lobby visit, we thought about what's the image that's going to capture that person that when they go in to vote, that's all they can think about. So we collected combat boots from people who had served and who had been kicked out, and they signed the boots with their personal stories of their discharge. And we delivered those boots, and we said to Jim Webb, if this was important enough for you for your son, think about the families that are suffering because you're throwing them out and all they want to do is serve their families, and they want to serve this country. And so those boots served as a political iconic image that would further the conversation. And I'll end it by saying that that sense of urgency is also what angered Barack Obama, because after we put the 6 service members on the fence, Barack Obama was flying out to the LA area to do a fundraiser for Barbara Boxer, and it is one of the only videos that I've ever seen Barack Obama get thrown in a public appearance. If you watch him, he is awesome with people trying to heckle and throw him off, but this is the first moment I'd ever seen him show any type of agitation, and it was GetEQUAL hecklers that we had paid to attend the event, and we kept zapping and popcorning him saying, when will Don't Ask, Don't Tell be brought to the floor? When will Barbara Boxer take leadership on this issue? Why are we fundraising? And so we constantly, he's trying to give a speech, trying to fundraise, trying to get and win back the Senate in reality. But he was angry. And what we know from White House pool informants is that he got in the limo and back on Air Force One and said, I want to be briefed immediately about what's going on around Don't Ask, Don't Tell, because I am not dealing with this at every single event. And so in reality, he also said right after that, why are they so mad at me? I feel like we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. And we were all doing what we were supposed to be doing, but we all were doing it from different angles. And I think that the major thing that I can say for all of you as students is you are the future leaders that are going to be in those rooms. And this question you need to be thinking about as you're in this moment is, am I going to use those tools in the toolbox and use that spoke to create the wheel that's going to go the farthest? Or am I going to use my access and not utilize those moments? There were people that are not sitting here that told us to get out of DC. They didn't want us there. That was not the conversations. They didn't want us to push as hard, but they also didn't tell us to go away. And so that would be my 2 cents to all of you.
And then, oh my God, the birds are taking over. And so, as you heard, there continues to be a ban on trans people serving in the military. And so, before we open it up to talk with all of you, I wanted to ask Freyja to share her story and to talk about what life is like in the military right now and what you see as the road forward in terms of the kind of change we continue to need to work for.
So, to really understand my perspective, I would say we should go back to the day that Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed. And you look at where I was. I had recently returned from my second deployment to Iraq. I had fellow service members in my unit that were openly gay. Some of them were my very, very best friends. And we served in Iraq. These are combat medics for the most part, because at the time I was in a combat support company that supported an infantry brigade. And they were on the front lines with the infantry soldiers, pulling them out of harm's way and saving their life. Because at the end of the day, nobody cares what you do behind closed doors on the front lines of battle. They care about, can you do your job? And the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell was a bit of a letdown for those of us who are transgender. Now, me personally, I was still very much struggling with my transgender identity. I couldn't figure out what was wrong. I couldn't figure out why things didn't quite mesh between my brain and my body. But I knew that there was definitely something going on, and I really liked feeling feminine and dressing feminine. So here I am. I'm in Germany getting ready to PCS back to Fort Bragg. And at this time, I spent the next 3.5 years as a stat lab non-commissioned officer at the hospital working the off shifts. And that left me with a lot of time without my family to sit and ponder, how can we get transgender service open? And I would have these conversations with my fellow service members working in the lab between midnight and 8:30 in the morning. And I'll tell you, I had some very, very intellectually brilliant lab techs that I worked with, and we had some wonderful conversations, but it always came back down to, it's probably not going to happen. So I went from Fort Bragg to Korea, and I served 2 years in Korea. The second year I got to have my family with me. And it wasn't until I was PCSing, that's a permanent change of station, from Korea to Fort Sam Houston, where I'm currently stationed, when the policy came out to allow open service for transgender service members. I was just getting to the point where I was comfortable admitting internally that I'm transgender, but I still could not get to the point where I could say it out loud. So here I am. I PCS to Fort Sam Houston to be an instructor within the Medical Laboratory Services program. And immediately I loved what I was doing. I volunteered for that position. Teaching is in my heart and soul. So I was talking to my now ex and trying to figure out, okay, I need to make this happen. I need to be able to do this because I am ready to burst. But the policy had been changed, and here I am going through all these classes, getting told on a daily basis from the leadership, we will support you if you are transgender and you need to come out and be yourself. And I just kept thinking, I teach soldiers that are right out of basic training and sailors that are right out of corpsman school. And are they really going to let me keep teaching if I'm transitioning? I was terrified. But I hit my breaking point. That was in January of 2018. So for the individuals who fought to make this happen, we're talking about Logan Ireland, Layla Ireland, Jennifer Peace, and Elle Cook. They are the 4 that really were making things happen. And if you want to see the story of what they did in DC, watch the movie Transmilitary. It is mind-blowing. What they went through to be able to allow individuals like myself to serve with our authenticity. So for me in 2018, when I finally did come out to my chain of command, and I told my commander, it was actually at a very serendipitous time when my company commander was changing out. So I was telling the outgoing commander and the incoming commander simultaneously. And they both looked at me and they said, "We support you. What can we do to support you?" And then the incoming commander looked at me and said, "I know someone who is a transgender service member. Would you be okay with me sharing your information so that you have a mentor?" So I'm one of those few rare individuals who's been absolutely blessed, because I've had support from the day that I came out and shared my authenticity with my entire chain of command, to have the support all the way up to the first commanding general in my chain of command. Now, here I am. I held off. I didn't start hormones. I didn't start my medical transition. I started my social transition first. And I didn't start my medical transition until the end of August. It was August 29th of 2019 when I started taking hormones the very first time. And in the meantime, we've got all this nonsense going on with news and rumors and tweets. And it was nerve-wracking, because the military operates on policy. And if it's not coming out in policy, then we just keep marching forward. And that's basically where we were at, is, okay, does this apply? Does this not apply? There was a lot of confusion, because this is not the way that Army policy has been changed in the last 200 and some odd years. So when the policy finally came into effect, we found out 30 days prior. I actually was fortunate enough to find out just a couple days before they published the initial warning of the policy. And this was in March of 2019. And I got notice because my sister used to work as a JAG officer, and she still gets the Pentagon emails. Actually, she's still serving as a JAG officer in the Air Force, which I'm very proud of. So she helps me out by sending me this information. "Hey, Freyja, you need to know this is what's coming your way." Because at the time, we had no idea what the new policy was going to entail. All we knew was that the president told us he didn't want transgender individuals in the military, that we would not be allowed to serve. And here I am, at that point, 17 plus years of active military service. And you want to kick me out? What's it going to take to replace me? So, and I'm just one. Just one. So when the policy came into effect, what it did is it stated that it is not a ban on transgender service. The policy states that it is more or less a disqualifying factor for individuals with gender dysphoria that require medical transition to serve in the military. So if I were to try to serve in the military as myself now, I would not be allowed to serve. They say that there's waiver, that you can apply for a waiver. Nobody has been approved for a waiver yet. Nobody. And there are individuals trying. So at this point, there are less than 1,500 transgender service members serving on active duty in all 5 branches. We have individuals ranging from privates, your E1s, all the way up to 06. One of my best friends is a captain in the Coast Guard, and she serves with honor just like I do. Yet, we're told we don't belong? That we don't meet the expectations or the standards for service? I don't get it. The policy states we can serve because we were grandfathered, and if you look at the reality, it's more or less a way of saying you can serve, but no one else will be allowed to because you don't meet qualifications. And this is where we're at now. How do we ensure, moving forward, that my siblings that are now in the closet They can go to behavioral health. They can get counseling. But they are in the closet when it comes to being able to serve as their authentic selves. What do we have to do to make that change happen?
I'm not sure how long we've been up here talking, but I'm hoping we have time for some of your questions, if you have any. Yes.
So like when you're working on bills or policies where like human rights is the focus and you don't really want to budge on that, what's the role of compromise? So like when you go onto like the House floor, what's the role of compromise and like trying to keep the essence of a bill when like things keep getting taken away?
I think that one of the most important things, I think of like the hate crimes bill, or even Brian was talking about the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, the legislation to guarantee, that LGBT people are not discriminated against in the workplace. I think one of the important things is to always have a diverse coalition. So for instance, in the fights in Congress to guarantee workplace safety, or the hate crimes bill, having legal groups and civil rights groups, labor organizations, all sorts of people who bring different experience to bear are really important, because sometimes, for instance, a bill, there'll be something in a bill that says everybody has to adhere to this policy, but religious institutions are exempt, right? We talk a lot about compromise around what they call religious exemptions. And so to answer your question, right, like in that sort of an example, how much do we compromise? We compromise only so much that the bill actually still has merit and strength and enforceability. That's an example of where there's been a fair amount of back and forth, but it is a lot of different people from a lot of different backgrounds with a lot of different lived experiences, civil rights, labor, LGBT groups, legal groups, the ACLU, Lambda Legal, all taking a look at it and saying, right, there's a line, right, that we can go to that exempts a church, right, but does not exempt a religious bookstore, right? Or there's all sorts of places that you could land along that line, but I think having a diverse set of people as a part of that discussion guarantees that you're going to land in a place that creates some compromise and some sort of a carve-out, but not so much that it becomes unenforceable. And it oftentimes feels, for me, I did, after I left the Human Rights Campaign, I did a lot of work around the issue of pay equity for the National Partnership for Women and Families and other groups, minimum wage, and there's always compromise. There's always raising the minimum wage has been something that has been fraught with compromise. And I always feel like the wider you open up your coalition and the wider you open up to lived experience and people who can really inform that decision beyond just your own, in our case, right? Even sometimes I feel like just LGBT groups, right? Like I always felt like we were stronger in sort of taking those kinds of things on when we opened it up to a broader cross-section of people to help us think through, where did we need to draw the line?
I want to say that I totally understand what he's saying, but there's also an element where compromise can actually harm. So for example, INDA at the time, Barney Frank, an openly serving male, was saying that we should take trans people out of INDA because he didn't think it was going to pass at the time. And my analogy I would go back to is we act more starved. And we say we are not going to compromise, and that if that means that we have to be more agitated, if we have to do more action, if we say that we're going to not deal with it now, but we're going to come after you in your own election, even though you're one of us, that's saying you're not willing to compromise that element. The harder part for the person who's trying to lobby that person and work for them to move on lots of different bills is that you lose that person as an ally, and you're trying to ask yourself, am I cutting my nose off despite my face? But if you're doing it correctly politically, you might pull in the people that say, hey, this guy needs a nudge or this lady needs a nudge, because if they're not getting the nudge, then they're not going to move on this with us. And the earlier question that you asked about the groups that were moving, where the DACA or the DREAM Act was being voted on in the morning and failed, and later in the afternoon we were able to pass DADT repeal. There were lots of dreamers that we were working with that said, you have the privilege of taking risk because you won't be deported. You have the risk of putting a service member on the fence because they've already been kicked out. It's not like they're going to lose their right to serve. So they've already lost their right to serve. So the urgency, we looked like starved, crazed maniacs. And the lack of advantage is I never got to meet Barack Obama. Everybody but Freyja and I have not, because I was looked at as unpolite and unreasonable and not liked. And I deeply admire, I cried when I was arrested the first time because I was compromising my feelings about believing in an African-American president that I truly believed in, and getting arrested at his fence was heartbreaking.
And I think, one of the healthiest things I think about our work is that this sort of debate was always, this discussion was always really central. And a lot of times people would say on marriage equality, for instance, never compromise. We won't take anything less than marriage. We will take nothing less than marriage. And in my role, right, I remember I used to travel the country and go speak at corporations to, sort of the LGBT work groups in corporations. And I would never want to sort of just stay in the C-suite. I remember I went to a Ford Motor Company one time, and I went down on the floor, and they told me that the company gives domestic partnership benefits. This is before marriage, right? If you've got a partner, we'll give your partner health care. But the law doesn't allow us to just give them health care. We have to put a value on it. So before marriage equality, if your partner got insurance through work, they were taxed on it. And I used to meet people who would say, I can't afford the tax. And I remember people would say, well, it's like $100 a month. Isn't that worth it to insure your partner? But there were people working on the plant floor who couldn't afford it. And I used to get from the community people who would say, do not compromise for anything short of marriage equality, because that stuff feels like crumbs. And it was a difficult place to be in, because I said it may feel like crumbs for some, but it's the difference between healthcare or not for others. And so, you had to.
Looking for the political.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Yes. A necessary first step to
eventually get to where it got.
I always felt, my point about why they wanted to do hate crimes first, and Eric's point about what it's like to talk to members, the thing that really sort of singularly struck me about this work is how devoid of courage a lot of members of Congress are, and how unwilling they are to really step outside of what they see as being complete alignment with their district. And so I do think that the Obama administration's view was, you've got to give them a couple of building blocks. You've got the number of members who would say, my God, I voted for the Matthew Shepard hate crimes bill, and then when I went home, I thought I was going to get off the plane and they were going to be standing there at the airport ready to recall me. I was like, isn't that amazing that they didn't? So I do think that the exercise of, and even Don't Ask, Don't Tell, as difficult as it was like a process challenge for us to break through in the Senate. We passed it in the House with very little trouble. I do think those sorts of things gave members this sense of okay, I thought that would be harder and it wasn't. So, what do you got next? I do think that.
Can I say something to that? But for me, it felt like crumbs. So that's what he's talking to. So the National Equality March is happening at the same time that his organization is doing the national dinner and inviting, Barack Obama is speaking at the national dinner, and we are marching on Washington saying we want a full equality bill and nothing less. We don't want to compromise anything. And then when GetEQUAL was launched, part of the discussion internally, what we had learned doing at the Highlander Center, where Rosa Parks had been trained and others on civil disobedience, they talked about the civil rights movement specifically around the right to serve for people of color. And they were talking about interracial marriage and the decision that had gotten made during the push for interracial marriage and how do we go about it. Loving was the perfect case to send because of the story and because of the discrimination, but the right to serve happened before that. And the reason for that is because if a brother or a sister has served in the platoon with me and I come back and I'm in the States and I'm realizing that my brother is being denied the right to marry his white wife or his spouse that he wants to give benefits to, that needs to be challenged. And so what we were told is you go after military service first and marriage equality is going to come, because those service members are going to come back and they're going to say, I want my platoon member to get what I'm getting because they had my back, they bled with me. And so to your point, yes, there is a natural progression, but for the activists, we want everything.
We have time for one more question. Bill?
I'm dovetailing off, but I think my question is to Sergeant Eccles. It would seem to me that your very presence creates both a due process and an equality, 14th Amendment issue for the implementation of this. So I'm wondering if there have already been or there plan to be some legal cases that would challenge this implementation. I realize it's been fairly quickly, but again, it just seems to me.
Okay, so
standing here
you're
going and saying,
absolutely right.
it's crazy.
There are multiple court cases currently pending that are slowly moving through the federal courts. The problem is that every time the defenders, or every time they bring out one argument for transgender service, another argument is thrown out against transgender service. And a couple of these service members are still actively serving while suing the federal government. And these are upstanding members of SPARTA. SPARTA is the organization for actively serving transgender service members to be able to get together, work together, help each other out, and understand the system and the process and how to actually accomplish our goal of just being ourselves.
And their spouses are winning Spouse of the Year awards.
Right, right. And that's exactly what Robin and I were talking about earlier. You have Layla Ireland. Layla Ireland is married to Logan Ireland. Layla Ireland was medically retired from the Army shortly after the policy changed under the Obama administration. And currently, as a spouse of an Air Force Staff Sergeant, she is now the Army Spouse of the Year and in line to possibly win the Military Spouse of the Year.
And her husband is openly serving.
Right, they're both
Transgender
they're
well.
they're
They're
both
transgender.
transgender. They both served. He's still serving, and he's not just Air Force. He's Space Force too.
So we've been here 9 minutes, but it feels like 9. It's so compelling, and I want to say that in an era where it's easy to grow cynical about change, the incredible work that you've all done is a testament to the capacity to do that. And I was particularly interested in the exchange that you had over a very good question of compromise and what one is willing to give up and what one has to do for the realpolitik and pragmatics of the situation. And you saw that in Joe and Robin's answer going back and forth. But I want to conclude by saying thank you, Freyja, thank you, Eric, thank you, Danny, for your service. We're deeply grateful to you. And thank you, Joe, for organizing this panel.
Nice to meet all of you.
Go forth and create change.
Exactly.
Make sure to vote. Yeah.
I was going to say, nice legs. Joe was going to say thank you. Joe was going to say thank you.
I gotta tell you, I was looking forward to meeting you after.
But I was.
Oh, yeah, I asked Joe. There, I didn't make better